The mountain mechanic's forbidden repair that saved dozens of broken tractors. Vernon Mackey's hands were shaking when he opened the certified letter that March morning in 1952. Not from fear exactly, though there was some of that. Mostly from anger at what 3 pages of legal language were trying to tell him, that helping his neighbors was now considered a crime. International Harvester's attorneys had been thorough. They had photographs of his work, sworn statements from their regional representatives, documentation of every tractor he had brought back from the dead using methods their engineers said were impossible. The letter used words like unauthorized and liability and litigation, but what it really said was simpler than all that legal noise. "Stop fixing tractors our way or we will destroy you." Vernon read it twice standing in the doorway of his shop, morning sun catching the dust that hung in the air like gold powder. Behind him sat 4 tractors belonging to families he had known his entire life. The Hendersons who would lose their farm if their farm all stayed broken. The Colemans who had 3 kids and a mortgage they were already behind on. The Jessops who had buried their youngest son last winter and did not have another loss left in them. He folded that letter and put it in his shirt pocket, right over his heart, where he would feel it all day. Then he walked back into his shop and lit the forge. The real story starts 16 years earlier, winter of 1936, when Vernon was barely 19 and thought he knew everything about nothing. He was working a lumber operation deep in the Smokies, where the mountains got so steep you had to lean back just to look at the sky. They had a log skidder that was older than most of the men running it, a beast built around a marine engine that could pull timber down slopes no animal could handle. 30 families depended on that machine, keeping the operation running through winter when there was no other work to be had. The morning it broke, the sound echoed off the mountainsides like a gunshot. Vernon was 100 yards away and he felt it in his chest, that crack of something fundamental coming apart. By the time he got to the machine, the foreman was already doing math in his head about how many men he would have to lay off. The main drive gear had split clean through, not broken teeth or a stripped face, but a fracture that ran right through the hub and turned one gear into 2 pieces of expensive scrap metal. The nearest replacement was maybe in Knoxville if they could find one, maybe in Chattanooga if they could not. Either way, it would cost more than the company had and take longer than the company could wait. Vernon spent 2 days just looking at that broken gear, while grown men sat idle and families wondered how they would eat. He borrowed every book the county library had on metalworking, which was not many and not helpful. What changed everything was talking to Silas Boone, an old black man who had worked in railroad shops before the century turned, and who most people thought was half crazy from the stories he told. Silas came up to the operation because someone told him a young fool was trying to fix something that could not be fixed, and Silas had always been interested in young fools. He looked at that broken gear for maybe 5 minutes, running his fingers over the fracture like he was reading Braille, and then he said something Vernon never forgot. Metal has memory, boy. Remembers being ore in the ground, remembers the fire that made it, remembers every load it ever carried. When something breaks, it is telling you its whole life story. Most people, they just see broken and they give up. But if you listen close, if you understand what the metal is saying, sometimes you can give it a new story to tell. What Vernon did with that gear became the foundation of everything that came after. Though he did not know it at the time, he built a jig from timber and threaded rod that held both pieces in perfect alignment. He constructed a forge from fire brick and a hand-cranked blower that he operated himself until his arm felt like it would fall off. He heated that gear section by section, never hot enough to ruin the steel but warm enough to make it workable. Then he did something that no engineer would have approved of and no factory manual would have described. Using techniques that Silas taught him, methods that came from men who had kept trains running across a continent with nothing but hand tools and stubbornness, Vernon drilled precision holes at calculated angles through the fracture plane. He drove hardened pins that he made himself on a borrowed lathe, each one fitted so tight it took a hammer to seat it. He used copper shims thinner than paper, compressed until they cold welded into gaps you could not see without a magnifying glass. It took 3 weeks. His hands blistered and bled and blistered again. His back ached from leaning over that gear. The company owners came by twice to ask when he would admit it could not be done, so they could start making other plans. Vernon just kept working. When they finally installed that gear and fired up the skidder, Everyone stepped back except Vernon. He stood right there next to the machine, close enough to die if he was wrong, and watched that gear take the load. The engine caught. The drum turned. They hooked onto a log that must have weighed 4 tons and started the pull. The gear held. More than held, it sang with the strain, like it was happy to be working again. It held through that winter and the next 2 after it. It held until the skidder finally went to scrap in 44 for the war effort. And when they cut that housing open, Vernon's repair still looked sound enough to run another decade. That should have been the end of the story. A young man doing one impossible thing and then moving on with his life. But word spreads in mountain communities, travels on logging roads and at church socials and over fence lines, where neighbors talk about weather and crops and whether anyone knows a man who can fix what is broken. By 46, Vernon had married Caroline Fletcher, who taught school and had opinions about everything. And they had bought 40 acres with a house that needed love and a barn that needed more than that. Vernon set up shop in that barn with equipment he mostly built himself, because buying it new was out of the question. A lathe made from salvaged factory parts, a drill press that could hold tolerances that would surprise a factory machinist, a forge that could bring steel to exact temperatures using nothing but his eye and his judgment. The work came slowly until it came all at once. A neighbor brought in a farm awl with a cracked cylinder head. The dealer had said replace it, several $100s they did not have. Vernon fixed it using a technique called pinning and peening that he had learned from Silas, driving hardened pins across the crack and then hammering the surrounding metal in ways that actually drew the fracture closed. It held for 9 years. That neighbor told his brother-in-law, who told his cousin, who told everyone at the feed store, and suddenly Vernon had more work than one man could handle. Tractors with broken blocks and cracked housings and damaged parts that dealers said were not worth fixing. Vernon fixed them all, and every repair taught him something new about what was possible when you stopped accepting what you were told was impossible. But what really set Vernon apart was not just that he could fix things others could not. It was why he fixed them the way he did. Most mechanics tried to make broken equipment look new again, tried to hide the failure like it was something shameful. Vernon took the opposite approach. He accepted that something had broken, and he built his repairs around that failure, using it as the foundation for something stronger. He called it engineered reinforcement, though that made it sound fancier than it was. The idea was simple, even if the execution was not. When a casting cracked, do not try to weld it back together and pretend it never broke. Instead, build a structure around that crack that makes it irrelevant. When a shaft snaps, do not try to join the pieces. Create a sleeve that uses the broken shaft's own weight to reinforce the repair. Turn weakness into strength by accepting what failed and building around it. By the late 40s, Vernon's reputation had spread across 3 counties. Farmers hauled equipment to his shop from 50 miles away, tractors on flatbed trucks, or limping along on their own power with drivers praying they would make it. Every machine had a story. Every owner had a family depending on that equipment, keeping them in business one more season. Vernon fixed a John Deere for the Simmons family after their oldest boy died in the Pacific, and they did not have it in them to lose anything else. He repaired an Oliver for a widow named Martha Yates, who was trying to keep her land after her husband's heart gave out mid-harvest. He brought back an Alice Chalmers for the Pritchard brothers, who were known for fighting each other over everything, except the one thing that mattered, which was keeping their father's farm running the way he would have wanted. Each repair was a calculation of stress and material and technique, but it was also something more personal than that. It was Vernon telling these families that broken did not mean finished, that with enough understanding and enough work, almost anything could be saved. That was when the manufacturers started paying attention. The first warning came in '50, a regional rep from International Harvester, who showed up unannounced and watched Vernon work for an afternoon. The man was polite but firm. What Vernon was doing violated warranty terms. It deviated from approved procedures. The company could not be responsible for equipment that had been modified by unauthorized mechanics using unapproved methods. Vernon listened without saying much, then showed the man around his shop, pointed out repairs that had been running for years without problems, explained the engineering principles that made his techniques work. The rep admitted the work looked solid, but said that did not change company policy. Vernon kept working the way he always had. More warnings came over the next year. Dealers started telling farmers that equipment repaired by Vernon would not be covered under any warranty. Parts suppliers began requiring documentation before they would sell certain components. There were rumors that some companies were building lists of independent mechanics who were doing repairs that fell outside official channels. Then came that letter in '52, and Vernon knew this was different. This was not a regional rep trying to enforce policy. This was corporate attorneys in Chicago or Detroit, or wherever they kept the people whose job was making sure everyone followed the rules. This was the kind of pressure that could break a small operation, legal costs piling up until there was nothing left but debt and failure. Caroline found him that evening on the porch, watching the sun drop behind the mountains. She sat beside him without speaking, waiting the way she always did for Vernon to work through whatever was turning in his mind. Finally, he told her about the letter, about the legal threats and the choice he was facing. He could stop doing the repairs that kept him up at night, stick to work that fell inside the lines someone else had drawn, turn away neighbors who needed help he knew how to give. That was the safe choice. Or he could keep working the way his conscience told him was right, knowing it might cost them everything they had built. Caroline did not hesitate even a second. She said they had not left teaching jobs in town and bought this land and built this shop so Vernon could spend his life being safe. They had done it so he could do work that mattered. If that made some lawyers unhappy, well, let them come to the mountains and explain to the Henderson family why their tractor should stay broken so some company could sell them a new one they could not afford. Vernon wrote his response that night, told International Harvester's legal department that he was performing legitimate repairs using sound engineering. He was not claiming factory authorization or approval. He was fixing broken equipment for people who needed it fixed. If they wanted to take him to court over that, he would be there. 6 weeks later, they sent an engineer named Thomas Whitmore to evaluate whether Vernon's work was actually dangerous or just inconvenient for their business model. Whitmore was maybe 30, engineering degree from Purdue, 3 years in the company's service development group. He showed up expecting to find shoddy work done by someone who did not understand what they were doing. What he found instead shook everything he thought he knew about mechanical repair. Vernon showed him everything over 4 days, demonstrated his compression sleeve technique, explaining stress distribution in ways that made Whitmore pull out a notebook and start taking notes, walked him through cylinder head repairs that violated every factory protocol but worked better than factory specifications, explained his tension frame concept with diagrams that showed how the repair actually redistributed loads in ways that eliminated the stress concentrations that had caused the original failure. Whitmore measured completed repairs with calipers and micrometers he had brought from the factory, checked tolerances and alignments, examined welds and pins and compression fittings with increasing confusion. Nothing Vernon was doing followed approved methods, but everything Vernon was doing worked, and more than that, showed an understanding of materials and stress that most factory engineers never developed. On the last day, Whitmore sat in Vernon's small office and said something remarkable. He said Vernon's work was creating a problem the company did not know how to solve. His repairs kept old equipment running when company policy wanted farmers buying new models. His techniques were spreading to other mechanics, creating knowledge that existed outside official channels. His success proved that the company's claims about repair limitations were business decisions, not engineering truth. Whitmore said he would write an honest report. Vernon's repairs were technically sound. They did not pose safety risks. They demonstrated sophisticated understanding. But they violated company procedures, and what the legal department did with that information was beyond his control. Then Whitmore asked if he could stay one more day. Not for the company, he said, for himself. Because what Vernon was doing was real engineering, real problem solving, the kind of creative work that had made Whitmore want to be an engineer in the first place, the kind of work that did not exist inside corporate structures and approved procedures. Vernon taught him everything he could in that extra day: how to read metal grain structure, how to predict failure points, how to selectively heat-treat components using equipment you built yourself, the philosophy behind engineered reinforcement, about accepting failure and building strength around weakness. Whitmore went back to Chicago with a report that probably was not what the lawyers wanted. Vernon never heard from International Harvester's legal department again, The pressure from that direction just evaporated, though Vernon suspected the company decided that fighting him would create more problems than it solved. But other manufacturers kept pushing back through the 50s. Dealerships enforced warranty restrictions harder. Parts became harder to source. Some companies redesigned components specifically to make field repair more difficult. Planned obsolescence dressed up as improved reliability. Vernon adapted to all of it. When parts became impossible to get, he fabricated them from raw stock. When assemblies were supposedly not rebuildable, he figured out how to rebuild them anyway. Every obstacle made him more creative. The work nearly killed him, though. 14-hour days, 6 days a week. Farmers lined up for months waiting their turn. Equipment hauled in from 4 counties. Vernon losing weight he could not afford to lose. Caroline watching him run himself down while he insisted he was fine. In '56, she put her foot down. Vernon needed help, or he needed to turn away work, and she knew which one he would choose. He brought in Ray Foster, a young mechanic with good hands and better instincts. Vernon taught Ray everything, sharing knowledge without reservation, until Ray understood not just how but why. Over the next years, Vernon trained 5 more mechanics. Each one learned his techniques and carried them to other communities. The knowledge spread like dandelion seeds, taking root in shops across Tennessee and Kentucky and into North Carolina. What started as one man's methods became shared wisdom, passed through demonstration and explanation, until it was bigger than any one person could claim. By '60, Vernon's shop was legendary. Farmers knew they could bring equipment declared dead and get it running. Mechanics traveled from surrounding states to learn techniques no technical school taught. Even factory engineers visited quietly, wanting to understand methods their companies officially prohibited but clearly worked. There was a repair in '63 that brought together everything Vernon had learned over 30 years. Paul Hendricks was barely 25, just starting out, when his Oliver Super 88 rolled down a hillside after brake failure and smashed into rock. The damage was catastrophic. Frame bent, axle housing cracked, transmission case broken, engine mounts destroyed. Total loss by any reasonable assessment. But Hendricks was at the beginning of everything, and that Oliver represented years of saving and hoping. He asked Vernon if there was anything possible, already knowing the answer should be no. Vernon spent 10 days just looking at that wreck, measuring damage, planning an approach that was more reconstruction than repair. He cut away destroyed sections and welded in reinforcements stronger than original. Built a tension frame for the compound fracture in the axle housing. Fabricated new engine mounts from solid steel. Every major component got a tension that transformed damage into opportunity. The work took 4 months and cost Hendricks everything he could scrape together. But when it was done, that Oliver was transformed. It looked the same, but every critical structure had been reinforced and strengthened. Hendricks farmed with it for 22 years through work that would have broken lesser machines, and it never failed him. By the early '70s, Vernon was past 60 and finally showing it. The heavy work took longer to recover from. His hands ached in the mornings. Caroline was encouraging him to slow down, maybe train someone to take over eventually. He brought in David Chen, a young mechanic with technical skill and creative thinking. Spent 2 years teaching David everything, making sure knowledge built over decades would not die with him. David absorbed it all with intensity that comes from understanding you are learning something rare. Vernon retired in '74, handed his shop to David, and spent his remaining years in the garden behind his house, watching mountains change with seasons. He passed in '81, but the tractors he repaired kept running. The mechanics he trained kept working. The techniques he developed kept being used across the Southeast. The forbidden repairs that manufacturers tried to stop became part of rural mechanical knowledge. They lived in every compression sleeve holding broken shafts together, every tension frame reinforcing cracked housings, every pinned and peened casting that held pressure years past its supposed failure. Vernon's legacy was not just specific repairs, impressive as those were. It was demonstration that real expertise exists outside official channels. That creativity and understanding overcome limitations of policy and procedure. That serving people in front of you matters more than following rules written by people who will never face consequences of those rules. The mountain mechanic, that manufacturers wanted to silence became instead a legend, a reminder that sometimes the forbidden path is the right path, and that standing up for what you believe matters more than staying safe inside lines someone else drew. Thank you so much for watching this story about Vernon Mackey and the forbidden repairs that saved families from financial ruin. If this inspired you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories about the ingenuity and determination that defined rural American life. Share this with anyone who appreciates real craftsmanship and the courage to stand up for what is right. Your support helps us preserve these important pieces of agricultural heritage. This video is inspired by true events and real repair techniques used by independent rural mechanics during the mid-20th century. It is not intended to represent or offend any specific individuals or companies. Vernon Mackey is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American mechanics who faced similar challenges from manufacturers and developed innovative solutions during this era. The repair techniques described are based on documented practices from the period, though specific names and locations have been adapted for storytelling purposes.